Good afternoon. Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here with you. I thought what I'd do is start by giving a few minutes, just a little bit of background about why I'm here, about the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, and then we'd have a discussion and ultimately turn it over to all of you and get to hear directly from you. It's very important as I go out around our region that I'm able to hear directly from people on the ground, what's happening in their communities, what's happening in the local economy. This is a very important part of my job, which I'm going to explain to you. And so that's why it's really critical for you to give me feedback, tell me what's on your mind, ask me questions, and give me comments. Let me start by just level setting about the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. Most people don't know the history of the Fed. I certainly didn't know it before I went to Washington, D.C. If you go back into American history, our country has always hated the idea of having a central bank at all. The Federal Reserve is our nation's central bank. So Alexander Hamilton created the first central bank. It lasted 20 years or so, and then they disbanded it. And the reason that they hated the idea of having a central bank is it didn't sound very democratic. A bunch of bankers in a dark room doing God knows what, it all sounds very bad. And so they said, let's get rid of this thing. Then there was a second one, then they got rid of that. And then in the late 1800s, our country was hammered by banking crises. And then there was a really big one called the banking panic of 1907. And then Congress said, well, we still hate the idea of having a central bank, but if we're going to have one, let's try to design it so it's not all concentrated in Washington, D.C., because we don't like the sound of that. So they created this hybrid structure with a board of governors in Washington, D.C. You've probably heard of Janet Yellen. She's the chair of the board of governors. She was appointed by President Obama and confirmed by the United States Senate. And then you have 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, including the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. And what's different about the regional Federal Reserve banks, I was not appointed by the President of the United States. I was appointed by a local board of directors of local leaders, business leaders, civic leaders, and I report to them. And they're the ones who decide whether or not to reappoint me. And the point of the structure is it distributes the power across the country. So in a sense, there are checks and balances. So this was Congress's idea in 1913. If we're going to have a central bank, let's distribute the power across the country. And so my region, the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, our region is Minnesota, North and South Dakota, Montana, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and part of Wisconsin. So a big part of my job is to travel around our region to hear from local citizens and leaders what's happening in the local economy, so that when I go back to Washington, D.C., 8 times a year for our FOMC meetings, which is Federal Open Market Committee, where we set interest rates for the country, I'm able to speak with deep knowledge about what's happening in our local economy and bring this local perspective back. That's why coming to meetings like this is very, very important. And that's also why I'm not up here reading a 90 or 60-minute speech. 1, it would bore you. 2, it would bore me. And 3, I wouldn't learn anything from you. And so that's why the discussion is a really critical part of why I'm here today and why we're having the format that we are. In fact, Greg just reminded me last week, my weeks blur together. Last week I was in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, meeting with their Rotary Club. And we had a great visit and a great discussion about what's happening in the South Dakota economy. And so that's why I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you for having me. I just wanted to level set on that structure because most people don't know that background. Now, somebody asked me in preparation for this if I could give just a little bit of a context for what the Federal Reserve interest rate meetings are like. And so I thought I'd just share that, and then I'll turn it over to Greg and then turn it over to all of you. So we meet 8 times a year. As I said, there are 12 Reserve Bank presidents. There are up to 7 governors. They're not all full right now. So up to 19 people around a very large table with a bunch of staff there as well. Every president is allowed to bring 1 person from their Reserve Bank with them. I usually bring somebody from our research department, one of our economists with me. In preparation for those meetings, we get about, depending on the month, 100 to 150 pages of detailed analysis from the staff in Washington, D.C. The Federal Reserve has more PhD economists working for us around the country than any organization in the world. So every piece of economic data that you may hear about on CNBC, there's a really good chance that we have a team of economists that are pouring through it, analyzing it for trends and underlying signals, and then they present their findings to us. So a lot of analysis goes into each meeting, a lot of preparation in terms of reading that analysis, trying to make sense of it. If you turn on the TV you'll see economic data that's sending all sorts of different messages. So one of the challenges for all of us is, how do you make sense of that? How do you get a signal from all of those different conflicting, noisy signals, in a sense? And the way I try to handle that is, we think we figured out, here are the handful of most important signals. Let's not get distracted by all of these other things that are flipping around a lot. Focus on the ones that in advance we've identified. These are the most important metrics, and then let those try to guide our decision making. And then we go into those meetings, everybody is exceptionally well prepared. I can tell you in 100% honesty, politics literally never, ever, ever comes up. You have people around the table who have very different policy judgments, but I can tell you with great confidence that people are doing their very best in the spirit of public service to read the data, analyze the data, and make the best decisions that we can on behalf of the country and for the goals that Congress has given us. And I'm going to speak about those goals for a second, then I'm going to turn it over to Greg. Congress has given us what we call a dual mandate. And that means we've got two primary objectives as it relates to monetary policy. Number one, stable prices. And that means inflation that's not taking off. You could think of an economy that's not overheating, also not limping along, kind of steady growth. And number two, maximum employment. And that means as many Americans who want to work as possible are able to get a job. Now, sometimes those two things are in conflict. If you have a lot of people who are unemployed, but you have inflation taking off, then the Federal Reserve might have to raise interest rates to cool down inflation, but that'll also probably put pressure on the job market. So sometimes they're in tension. The last few years, they've been working together. There's been slack in the job market, and inflation's been running low. So that means the Fed has been able to take its time in normalizing interest rates, and we can get into all of that in the Q&A. So thank you for having me here. I'm very much looking forward to hearing directly from you, and now I'll ask Greg to kick off the Q&A.
Okay. So I'm going to, hopefully you can hear me. I'm going to start with just a couple questions, and then we're going to turn it over to all of you. So I'll just get us started, and then look forward to having a lot of good questions from everyone here. First thing I wanted, by way of background, we talked a little bit about your biography, but tell us how this opportunity at the Fed came up for you. How did you get connected with the Fed and get in this position?
Sure. So I mentioned that the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis has a board of directors here, 9 members, some of whom are appointed by the Board of Governors in Washington, some are elected by local bankers, among others. They conducted a nationwide search. So they hired a search firm. They had a search committee. The banks, there are 3 banker representatives on our board of directors. By law, they are not allowed to participate in the search because they're not allowed to pick their regulator. So only the non-bankers were in the search. So there's 6 non-bankers. They hired Spencer Stewart, a nationwide search firm that conducted a nationwide search. That search firm contacted me. I said, yes, I'd be interested in interviewing for the job. I went through a multi-round interview process and then ultimately had to go to Washington to interview with Janet Yellen and the other governors, and they had to approve my appointment. So it was a very robust, formal interview process, exactly how you would hope it would be.
Great. This touches on something that you just mentioned, but a question about Fed independence. So in your experience, do you feel that the Fed is truly independent, and have you noticed a shift at all in that from the Obama administration to the Trump administration?
One of the miracles of economic policy over the past 30 or so years was that Republicans and Democrats recognized how important it was to have an independent central bank. If you look at the huge policy mistakes that the Fed made in the 1960s and 1970s, is that they were too beholden to politicians, and they let inflation take off. And then we had the stagflation of the 1970s, interest rates, double-digit interest rates, which some of you may remember, and all of the economic harm that came from it. Well, then President Carter selected Paul Volcker to be Fed chair, and President Reagan reappointed him. And Paul Volcker said, the Fed is going to be independent. We're going to do what's necessary to control inflation. And they ratcheted up interest rates very, very high to get inflation in check. And importantly, to demonstrate to the country that they were willing to provide the medicine that was necessary, even if politicians didn't like it in the short term. And that worked brilliantly. And to their credit, it was not clear that it was going to work, but it did work. And then when President Reagan reappointed somebody that had been appointed by a Democrat, Then after Paul Volcker's time was up, he appointed Greenspan, and then President Clinton reappointed Greenspan. You started having this bipartisan action of people reappointing one another's appointees. That really reinforced that the Fed is independent. So I've seen no change through my time in Washington or my time now at the Fed. And the great thing about the institution is it's in the DNA of the institution. People say, let's behave non-politically, do what's right for the country, do what the data is telling us, and that served the American people very, very well, and I have every reason to believe it's going to continue.
Great. This next question is a little longer. It's from Tom Bach of the Edina Noon Rotary Club, and it's about the national debt. So currently, GDP is about $18 trillion, roughly, and it grows at about 2% a year. The federal debt stands at $20 trillion and is growing at about $1 trillion a year. So given those trends, in 10 years, the national debt will be $30 trillion and GDP will be about $20 trillion, with a debt to GDP ratio of approximately 1.5 to 1, which is the point at which Greece fell into a complete financial crisis. Should this likely debt to GDP ratio and the potential that the US government could no longer finance the huge budget deficits concern us?
Well, long term, there's no question we have to get our fiscal house in order. No country can continue to run ever larger deficits forever. It just doesn't work. And we're different than Greece. A country that prints its own currency, we print our own dollars, is not going to technically default, meaning you can always print money to pay your creditors, right? So it's not, but, so there's a technical default. You should not be comforted by that. I'm glad you're laughing, okay? That was not meant to comfort you. There's a technical default, and then there's what's called an implicit default. The implicit default is what would more likely happen in our case, which is we just keep printing dollars, and you get paid back if you're a Treasury bondholder, but your dollars you're getting paid back aren't worth very much. In a sense, we end up inflating away our debts. That's what's called an implicit default. So we're not at risk of Greece, of that type of a sudden technical default, but there is always the risk of an implicit default in the future. Now, this is not about to happen. We have some time, but we don't have forever. And right now, the best thing we have going for us is that we have the strongest, most trusted economy in the world. But that doesn't mean it's going to be that way forever. You can imagine if Europe gets its act together, all of a sudden Europe may be an attractive place for global investors to put their money. And they may say, you know what? America can't make tough choices. Instead, we're going to invest in Europe. Or if China develops its capital markets, maybe they might choose to invest in China. That's when the pressure really will be brought to bear. So this is a very important issue. It's not tomorrow, but we need to get our house in order. Now, the problem is our democracy is much better at dealing with a crisis than it is with preventing a long-term problem. And so the question for us is, how do we reach political consensus to address this now while we have time? If we wait till there's a crisis of confidence, it's too late and the damage will be done.
I'd like to turn it over to you for questions. We have more up here, but I'd like to give you a chance to ask. Josh Sprague is over here with the microphone, and Mike Sitek as well. How about over here?
Thank you for being here today.
Hold on one sec.
Okay, my question is for you. Thank you for being here today. What do you think are the 2 or 3 most important factors for the Federal Reserve to consider in order to begin normalizing the balance sheet?
In order to begin normalizing the balance sheet, what are the 2 or 3 factors for the Federal Reserve to be most focused on for us to start normalizing the balance sheet? So let me just give some background. During the financial crisis, the Fed expanded its balance sheet. It's now at around $4.5 trillion of Treasury bonds and Fannie and Freddie Mac mortgage-backed securities, which we did to try to boost the economy once short-term interest rates were brought to zero. And we could talk about that if people have questions. So now we've said we have a desire to start normalizing the balance sheet, which we've said will begin fairly soon or reasonably soon is the current expectation. A couple things. One is we don't want to disrupt markets and we don't want to spook markets. So we've worked really, really hard to tell the markets exactly how we're going to normalize this balance sheet. And what we're going to do is, instead of selling off these bonds in exchange for cash, which could have some impact to the markets, we've said we're just going to let them roll off as they mature. So every day, every week, every month, some of our holdings mature. A 1-year bond matures in a year, or if we've been holding a 3-year bond for 3 years, it starts to mature. And then what we would just say is we're not going to replace it. So we'll just let it gradually roll off. So that's the first thing that's very important that we said we're going to do. And in June, we put out a very detailed statement explaining exactly how this process will gradually wind the balance sheet down. So I think we're going to be watching the markets, to looking at the treasury markets, how they are behaving, how investors are behaving for us to begin this process. We're going to look at the broader economic factors. I think you would expect to see us also look at the debt ceiling negotiations that are happening in Congress. I think we want to keep our eyes open to that process. Bottom line is, we do want to normalize the balance sheet. We think expanding the balance sheet was the right thing to do. We want to do it in a way that provides the least anxiety to the markets and provides the least risk of some form of disruption. So we're going to look at any signs for what could trigger that disruption. And I think so far we've done a good job of communicating this to markets, so markets have a lot of confidence about the way we're going to do this. But the actual pulling the trigger, we still got to keep our eyes open for what's happening.
Josh? How about right over here?
I've been reading lately about problems with productivity, the lack of growth in productivity in the economy, and that this may be connected to long-term stagnation, if you will, where the corporate profits will not grow. And if corporate profits do not grow, then you're not going to have increases in the markets, the stock markets. So my question to you is, first of all, do you agree with that hypothesis? Is that a problem, and is that the likely result? And secondly, if so, then what do we do to get out of that?
Yeah, it's a big problem. At least it has been in recent years. So if you look at where does economic growth come from for any economy, it comes from two things. One is population growth. You have more people to buy cars, to buy food, to buy homes. That makes sense. But productivity growth is enormously important for individuals in that society, for the pie to get bigger, for us each to have more to share in that pie. Productivity growth comes from education. A workforce that is more skilled will be more productive than one that's less skilled. And it comes from technology development. So being able to do more with the same resources. So our productivity is growing about half the rate it had been in prior decades. And we don't have a good answer for why. A lot of economists, including at the Fed, are studying this issue, and we don't have a good theory for why exactly that is. If you turn on the TV and you take out your iPhone, it seems like there's great innovations happening every day. Your iPhone is getting smarter every day. You've got social media. But some experts are asking, are these things really moving the needle or not? Compare this. Compare the technology development of the last 5 or 10 years to the technology development we read about that happened 100 years ago. So 100 years ago, we're talking about the airplane. We're talking about industrialization. We're talking about the electrification of society, the integrated circuit in the 1950s. Those were transformative technologies. Compared to the integrated circuit, Twitter is not very impressive. Let's just say that. And I question whether social media is even net productivity enhancing at all. I mean, we do get information faster, but let's also admit we also waste a lot of time on social media. So the question is, where are the new fundamental breakthroughs going to come from? And this is what's almost impossible to predict. So I can tell you productivity growth over the last decade has been very slow, but I have very little ability to forecast what it's going to be like in the next 10 years. One more example, I think the most important technology development over the past decade is not social media, it's fracking. Right? So all these wizards in Silicon Valley thought they're so smart. Little do they know, some roughnecks in North Dakota and in Oklahoma and in Texas were pioneering this breakthrough technology that's had a profound impact on the global economy. Who knows what's next? We do see self-driving cars and trucks coming. That's going to be disruptive, obviously for truck drivers and cab drivers, et cetera. But that could also be very much productivity enhancing. So productivity growth is enormously important. It's very hard to forecast. The only way we can affect it that we know of over the long term is investing in education and investing in research and development. And that's something that we could do to try to change the trajectory over the long term, but it's very hard to predict in the short term.
What are some of the things that the Fed might be doing now and can do to bolster the economy in rural America?
Well, I get this a lot. So when I travel, our region that I cover is very rural. And there's a lot of rural communities, and a lot of rural communities are losing their populations. Either some factory may have left, or young people are just choosing to go elsewhere for higher education, and then maybe they don't come back. And a lot of folks are saying, what do we do? And actually, it's interesting. When I was in Sioux Falls, now Sioux Falls is not a little town. It's a big, it's a city. But they've got some things right that I think the rest of the district can learn from. And I'll give you an example. So I talked about population growth as an important engine of economic growth. And if your population is shrinking, your economy is probably going to be shrinking, or a good chance of that. Now, think about this. We all have three choices when it comes to population growth. Number one, you can accept slower growth. You can just say, hey, this is out of our hands, we accept slower growth. I wouldn't vote for that, but that's an option. Number two, you can try to subsidize fertility. This is very expensive, but you could pay for free childcare, tax credits to encourage families to have more kids. And by the way, it's a long-term solution. You can't turn it on overnight, obviously. So that's an expensive option. Or number three, you could embrace immigration. Those are your three choices. And literally, it's math. There's no other mathematical solution to that problem. So small towns and rural communities need to decide, of those three choices, which one do you want? And when I was pleasantly surprised to learn in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, their population is actually growing pretty well. And why is it growing very well? Immigration. And I asked them, I said, why do you have so many immigrants? Guess what they said? They said, we have a lot of Lutherans here. And I said, I've heard this before. And they said, our Lutheran church in South Dakota has brought in a lot of refugees, and they've done a pretty good job of integrating them into the local economy. That's what's driving their population growth and their economic growth. And so I think that's not unique to South Dakota. I think other rural communities could also look at those same factors. So three things. One is address population growth. Number two, try to make the rural community as attractive for business as possible. And number three, try to make it attractive so that when young people go off and start their careers maybe somewhere else, that they might choose to come home and start their families back in the town that they've grown up in. I've seen some rural communities do a pretty good job of that. And so those are the three elements that I've seen some communities try to attack this problem. But you're right, it's a widespread challenge.
Thanks for coming, Neil. My question is, during the campaign last year, President Trump and others claimed that we could grow the economy at 3%, 4%, or 5%, which in the recent history has not been possible. What do you think is the realistic probability of that happening? A high growth rate, greater than 3%?
It's very, very hard to see how the math works. And the challenges are, number one is just the demographics. So our society is aging. We know this. We can model it. And unless we do something about population growth, the math in terms of that term, it is what it is. So, and if our immigration numbers go down, that's going to work against our overall growth rate. And then number two, the gentleman asked me about productivity growth. The second half of the equation is productivity growth. And is it possible we had some productivity miracle? It's possible, but these are very, very hard to predict. And we don't see anything right now that says that there's a productivity miracle about to happen tomorrow. And so I would love to see us grow at 3% or faster. This is real economic growth, net of inflation, but it's very hard to see how we get there unless the population growth rate really takes off or we have a productivity miracle.
Just a follow-up question on that, if I could.
Sure.
How would tax policy affect your answer to that question if there was any type of tax reform? And then a second question, different subject. Tell us about your time in Washington handling TARP, kind of the politics of that and your experience in Washington.
Sure. Well, tax reform, first of all, it's important that we separate tax reform from just a tax cut. What tax reform generally means is you raise some taxes, you cut some taxes, so the overall system is more efficient. And what that means is, right now, I think all of you know intuitively, our tax code is riddled with about 30 years of loopholes and special deductions that especially big businesses are very good at taking advantage of. So it creates a very distorted, uneven playing field that leads for all sorts of little micro misallocations of capital. Well, the theory is if you got rid of all of those distortions and loopholes and just use the money the extra revenue that you collect to lower tax rates for everyone, that's what tax reform is considered to be. It's more efficient. You raise the same amount of revenue. You would expect the economy to grow incrementally faster if it's just a more efficient tax. Think of it this way. If you spend less money on accountants and lawyers and more money on investing in your business and expanding, the economy is going to grow on the margin a little bit faster. No offense to the accountants and lawyers in the room. Okay. I saw all of you grimacing a little bit when I said that. But you understand what I mean by that. So tax reform on the margin would be net beneficial. But just a tax cut where you just say we're going to raise the deficit and cut some taxes and you don't make the system more efficient, that's not going to that may lead to a very short-term boost, right? If you borrow more money to spend more, yes, your GDP is going to be higher in the short run, but is your economy actually more productive? Is your economy actually more competitive than no? So I would hope that as a country, we're pursuing tax reform rather than just a deficit finance tax cut. And then what was the second part of your question? TARP. So there's a lot here. I'll try to be brief. So 06 to 09, I was at the U.S. Treasury Department. I worked mostly under President Bush, but then briefly also under President Obama. And I was one of the first responders to the financial crisis. The financial crisis felt like, for us, the economic equivalent of 9/11, which was our economy was suffering from a massive heart attack. And what motivated us every day was to try to prevent that heart attack from killing the patient. And that means us having a Great Depression type scenario. The good news is, as dysfunctional as our political system seems at times, in the moment of a crisis, man, did our elected leaders come together. Republicans and Democrats came together. In 2 weeks, they went from us asking for the TARP to them passing this unprecedented authority, and they put their political careers on the line. And many of them paid for their vote by not getting reelected because they voted for it. It was so deeply unpopular, but it was absolutely the right thing to do. And I'm proud that they took that action, and it worked. We stabilized the economy, and by the way, we got virtually all the money back for taxpayers. And so I'm happy to answer more questions about that, but it's something I hope we never, ever, ever have to do again. And by the way, one of the first things we did when I came to the Minneapolis Fed that they'd worked on in the past was to try to solve this too big to fail issue, because the biggest banks in America are still too big to fail. And it was the right thing to bail them out, because we all would have suffered if we'd let them all fail, but we never want to do it again. And we at the Minneapolis Fed have a plan to solve that. So thanks for asking about it.
Josh.
When you talk about population growth, that frightens me. I'm not sure how many people this earth can sustain. Back in the 70s, when I was having children, 2 children was the going rate, I think, at that point in time. We have 2 adopted children, so we're -2 on my scale. But how many people can this earth maintain? It's frightening to think that people are touting 4 or 8 children. We've been there, and I don't think that's sustainable.
Well, so a couple things. If you look at, and I haven't looked at this lately, but if you look at global forecasts of population growth, it's not growing forever. As societies are getting wealthier and they're getting more resources, population growth is slowing in virtually all advanced economies. US, Europe, Japan, et cetera. So I think the most forecasts have us leveling off at some point. But then that begs a second question. We don't yet have a good economic model of how you achieve economic growth without population growth. So right now, we could boost our population growth by drawing people from other countries. That's immigration. You're taking from some to come to America. But if we fast forward 50 years, let's say those forecasts are right, that the global population is now set and it's not going to be growing anymore. What does that mean for our global economy? I don't think we figured that out yet. I don't think we know. How do we have continued economic growth, continued prosperity? And then we start getting into lots of science fiction discussions about what happens when you've got automation of all these jobs and what happens if there are not enough jobs for workers. I will say this, people have been predicting doom and gloom for a very, very long time. For centuries, I think, people have been predicting that we'd run out of food, that population would grow and we'd all starve to death. That's never happened. Technology has kept up. Our productivity on farms has gone up and up and up. And so I'm not personally a subscriber of these doomsday scenarios that eventually we're going to run out of resources and the earth is going to collapse on itself. But I'm also honest by saying we don't know what the economy is going to look like once population growth has leveled off, and how does this system work? Does it just become a system of redistribution? Does it become a system of automation? I don't know yet. We have a lot to learn. So I appreciate you asking it. I wish I had a better answer.
I'm going to, go ahead, Jim. Sorry.
We pride ourselves on our regional economy here in Minneapolis, St. Paul. I'm wondering if you could comment on the strengths that you see in the regional economy and the challenges that we face in the years ahead. And then back to TARP quickly, I'm wondering, are Fannie and Freddie ever coming out of conservatorship?
Well, it's a good question. So regional economy, we have Twin Cities, Minnesota at large, has a lot going for it. We have a very diverse economy, meaning most major sectors of the U.S. economy are represented here in some scale, whether it's technology or healthcare or other types of services and manufacturing. And that serves us well because at any given time, some sector may be down and other sectors generally are going to be doing better, and that diversity really helps us. We talked about education and the workforce. On average, we have a very highly skilled workforce in Minnesota, a skilled population, and on average, we have good schools here, ranked 6th or 7th in the nation. So I would say we have a lot going for us to the positive. I would say the biggest challenge that I've seen are the disparities that those averages mask. I was surprised coming here to Minnesota at the extent of the racial disparities and urban-rural disparities that we have here. I was surprised because how much we have going for us, I would have thought those disparities would be smaller. Instead, those disparities are even larger in many cases. So I started asking questions about why these disparities exist here in Minnesota and around the country. I'll give you a little statistic that's shocking to me. In America, good times and bad, African American unemployment is almost always twice white unemployment. So if we have a recession and let's say white unemployment is 6, African American unemployment will be 12. If you have a booming economy and white unemployment is 3, African American unemployment will be 6. Even if you compare college graduate against college graduate or high school dropout against high school dropout, the ratio is the same. It's shocking how persistent it is. So I started asking questions of researchers around the Federal Reserve, why do these gaps exist? And they're not just racial gaps. As I mentioned, there's urban-rural gaps as well. And we have very few good answers explaining why these gaps are so persistent. So we need to understand this. And so what we're doing at the Minneapolis Fed is we've launched a major new research initiative called the Opportunity and Inclusive Growth Institute to use our research power to try to unravel what are the root causes of these disparities and what can policymakers do about it to try to close these gaps. It's in all of our interest, right? We talked about economic growth comes from skill development. It comes from population growth. Well, we need all of our population developing the skills and participating in the economy for their own sake, but for all of our sake as well. And so we don't believe that monetary policy can solve this. It's too blunt an instrument. But if we can do the research that arms our elected officials with the data and analysis they need, then we think that that's an important role for us to play. So we're going to try to do our part. But these issues are decades or more in the making. We're not going to solve them overnight, but we're going to try to do our part. What was your second part of your question? Fannie and Freddie. So Fannie and Freddie are the big government guarantee agencies that guarantee most mortgages in America, package them off as mortgage-backed securities. They were quasi-independent entities, and when they went into the tank in 2008, the U.S. Treasury Department took them over. And now they're in this what's called conservatorship, which is they're under the care of the Treasury, but they're supposed to be there in a temporary time, but they've been now for 8 years. They've been like that, or 9 years maybe. The question is just when Congress wants to take it on. And the fundamental question is, what role do the American people want the U.S. government playing in the housing market? Some people have said there should be no role whatsoever. Let it be the pure private market. Others have said the opposite, that they should keep guaranteeing a lot of the market. Then there are middle solutions. How to solve it is not hard. What the options are, putting the options on paper is not difficult. It's been done. The question is when there is going to be political will to actually take this on. And the challenge is why it has taken 8 years. Frankly, it seems like Treasury has done a good job putting them in this holding pattern, so there's no catalyst to force them out of that holding pattern. It seems like they can stay in that holding pattern for the foreseeable future, and so I don't know when it will be addressed. That's purely up to our political leaders.
Josh, do you have a question in back?
The Fed audit question or matter, I'm not quite sure where it's at right now, but what are your thoughts and what are the pros and cons if it happens?
Sure. So first of all, I'm glad you asked the question. This is one of those things where politics and reality are one's on Venus and one's on Mars. The Fed is audited every year by an independent auditor, and all of our books are audited. They're all available. You can go to the federalreserve.gov website right now and click on what I'm guessing is hundreds of pages of audited financials and disclosure. And every security we transact in, it's all audited, it's all publicly available, it's all there for the American people and anyone who wants to see it. So the Fed is absolutely audited every way you'd like. The Minneapolis Fed, we have KPMG auditing, we have internal auditors, we have Board of Governor auditors. It's all there. We publish an annual report. So the Fed is fully audited. So the people who are saying we need to audit the Fed, it's a little bit disingenuous. What they're really saying is we need to get our fingers in the Fed's decision-making on monetary policy. So what Congress has said in their wisdom, Republicans and Democrats, said we don't want the Fed to make monetary policy decisions for political reasons. So we're going to keep you independent. Well, some people don't like the decisions that we've been making, and they're saying we need to get into that decision-making process, so let's go in there and audit how they're making those decisions. And that, I think, is a terrible idea, because I think if you had 535 members of Congress offering their opinions about every decision the Fed was making, I don't think that would end well in terms of the economic outcome for the American people. The chair of the Fed goes and testifies before Congress regularly. I come out and give speeches. I publish articles about how I'm making the decisions to vote the way that I vote to maximize our transparency. So ultimately, we are accountable to the American people. But I don't think having people in there, think about the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court issues rulings. They issue their opinions. You don't get a transcript of their private deliberations. Well, you do get a transcript of the Federal Reserve's private deliberations. It's on a 5-year delay. 5 years from now, you will read a detailed transcript of everything that was talked about. The reason there's that 5-year delay is to try to encourage us not to think about short-term political considerations, not to try to act for the camera, to try to act in our best interest on behalf of the American people. So I think everybody at the Fed would agree auditing our monetary policy decisions is a bad idea. Rather, hold us accountable through all the various channels that we already have.
Just a quick follow-up question to that. If I have this right, in the two recent FOMC meetings in March and June, you were the only member voting not to raise rates. Can you talk a little bit about the balance between raising interest rates too quickly versus keeping them too low for too long?
Yes, that's right. So in March and in June, I was the sole dissenter voting against raising rates. Because I was the sole dissenter, we obviously went ahead and raised rates. So it's a democracy in a sense, and one vote does not carry the day. We're looking at the job market and we're looking at inflation. And over the last several years, the job market has gotten stronger and stronger and stronger. And the U.S. economy has been creating about 200,000 jobs on average a month, which is good. That's a really good thing. More Americans are going back to work. We only need about 100 to 125,000 jobs a month to keep up with population growth. So the economy is growing faster than population growth is necessary. And the headline unemployment rate has now come down to around 4.3%. But that headline unemployment rate only counts people who are actively looking for a job. There are some people who've just given up hope. So you have to look beneath the surface to try to figure out, is there still slack in the labor market? And my view is, yes, there has still been slack in the labor market. We've been misled to believing that the labor market is already at full strength because of all these folks who have left the job market. And so we've been looking at the job market, trying to figure out exactly when is it going to reach maximum. And we've been watching wages. Wages have been growing slowly. We expected as the job market got tighter, businesses would have to compete with each other for workers. That would drive wages up. that would drive prices up. These are the signals that we're looking at to try to figure out where is the economy. So I voted against raising rates because wages have not been growing quickly, inflation has been growing slower than our 2% target, and it still seems like there's some slack left in the job market. So there's no need to cool the economy down. So far, inflation has continued to undershoot our target, and wage growth has continued to be soft. So I continue to maintain there is no urgency to raising rates. Now, the other people around the committee are saying, well, that may well be true so far, but maybe wages are about to take off, and maybe inflation is about to take off. And if it does take off, we're then going to have to respond more aggressively. And so these are just reasonable people who are looking at the same set of facts, drawing different judgments.
My question is along that
Where are
same...
you? Sorry. Oh,
Back here.
standing in the back. Thank you.
Along that same line of interest rates, we've had historically low rates for a long period of time, and there are a lot of people that are relying on pensions and that are conservative, good, responsible savers. And I talk to a lot of them who are giving up hope of having a happy retirement because of rates being depressed for so long. So just give us an indication, in your opinion, of the next couple of years. Is there any hope that we're going to get some kind of a upswing in rates to help with retirement?
I'm going to give you an answer that's totally unsatisfying. If you look at what's happened to interest rates around the world over the last 30 or so years, they've gone down like this from 1980 to today. And it's not just been the US. It's happened in Europe. It's happened in Japan. The Federal Reserve, in my opinion, the Federal Reserve affects interest rates around this long-term trend. But the long-term trend is set by broader economic factors. So we talked about productivity growth. We talked about demographics. Those are trends that are happening in global economies. So it's remarkable. You think the US economy is so different from Europe and so different from Japan? There are a lot of parallels. All of our populations are aging, somewhat at a slower rate. Japan is further ahead of us. All of our productivities are growing very slowly compared to what's happening in the past. So I would say to your friends who are frustrated by the low rates, everything we know about the economic outlook, such as demographic trends and what we can see about productivity, suggests that interest rates are going to stay low. Now, I'm not talking about the Fed's short-term interest rate moves. I'm talking about where long-term rates have trended. It seems like that's here to stay. So we talk about a concept that we call the neutral real interest rate. This is the interest rate that we cannot exactly measure, but that balances savings and investment in an economy. If businesses are not finding attractive new investments to make, I'm not talking about buying back their stock, I'm talking about new technologies to invest in mass, then interest rates are going to be low. And so it turns out the answer to your question is very related to the gentleman's question about productivity. If we as a country or as a world develop breakthrough new technologies where there's going to be this huge rush of new investment, you're going to see interest rates go up all around the world. If we continue to have fairly unexciting breakthroughs in technology development where there don't seem to be great places to invest for new exciting opportunities, interest rates are probably going to stay low. And so unfortunately, that's why my answer is so unsatisfying. It seems like interest rates are going to stay low, but that's not because of the Fed. It seems like interest rates are going to stay low because of these broader macroeconomic factors that we, all of us, have trouble affecting.
We have a question over here.
Thanks, Neil. My question is going back to currency. So you talked about how we can continue to print money. So we have all this debt out there. So if we continue to print, someone has to buy our debt. So what happens with now all this cryptocurrency? You've got China pouring into Bitcoin and who knows what other nations. So what is the outcome of that? And what does the Fed do about all this cryptocurrency? I'd like to hear your thoughts on that,
Sure.
blockchain.
So, and I confess I'm not an expert in the blockchain, though it seems to be, pretty remarkably innovative technology. Who knows? Banks are experimenting with it. Who knows where it goes? Personally, I'm a skeptic that any kind of virtual currency is going to threaten the dollar or threaten government-issued currency, and here's why. The biggest selling point that I remember when Bitcoin first came out was they said you could never have runaway inflation. Because when Bitcoin was designed, they said there will only be so many Bitcoins ever produced by definition. So you have a finite supply of Bitcoins, and that gave you complete confidence that there could never be inflation, unlike any government-based currency, which could have inflation, right? But the problem is the barriers to entry of creating another version of Bitcoin, call it Neel coin or Greg coin, is very low. So go back to American history. There was a time when each state printed their own currency. Even if you had great confidence that Virginia was not going to print too many Virginia dollars, if New York printed away and Massachusetts printed away and Maryland printed away, you still had inflation. And so I have not heard anyone explain why this many different types of altcoins, how you deal with that in terms of the runaway potential inflation and the low barriers to entry. And so to me, we're paying attention, we're watching it, but as of right now, what I've learned right now, I'm not too worried about any of these virtual currencies threatening the dollar.
Hi. First of all, thank you for your service in the Treasury Department back in the financial crisis.
Thank you.
And the question I'd like to ask, you mentioned like the balance between the unemployment rate and interest rates. And it seems that unemployment is low and interest rates, with the recent hike, it seems to have balanced out. But what are the greatest challenges in the long run to keeping a stable economy with regard to these factors?
Well, I think I'm very impressed that the Federal Reserve as an institution has defined itself as being nonpartisan. So if both parties continue to respect the independence of the Fed, and the Fed continues to operate on its dual mandate of stable prices and maximum employment, I actually have a high degree of confidence that we will keep inflation in check and we will do a decent job of managing the ups and downs. I'm not going to predict, we still have recessions. Recessions are certainly still possible, but I don't see the ups and downs. I'm less worried about that. The biggest risk that I would see is if somehow that political independence was compromised and people said, no, the Federal Reserve needs to do the bidding of Congress or needs to do the bidding of the executive branch. That's ultimately what would undermine the progress that we have achieved. Again, I'm not saying there won't be economic cycles in the future, but I think the Federal Reserve does a pretty good job of managing these two different objectives. Do you have a follow-up? Or?
I was just wondering, of that 4.3 unemployment rate you mentioned, what part of that do you think is just cyclical in nature?
Of the 4.3% headline unemployment rate, what part of that is cyclical? We're not sure. So if you look under the covers, you have, this is what's called the U3 unemployment rate. You may read about this in the paper. That's the headline unemployment rate of people who are currently looking for work or in the job market. Then you have another slug of people who are stuck in part-time jobs, who would like full-time work, or who've given up. Those numbers have come down to roughly where they were before the financial crisis. But then if you look, another measure, if you look at the percentage of our population that is working, and you even strip out aging of society and just look at working age people, that is still low relative to where it was. So we don't exactly know, will that go back exactly to where it was? Will it stay roughly where it has been? We've been pleasantly surprised over the last few years how many workers have come back in. My view is let's keep this going. If inflation is not showing any signs of becoming a problem, let's keep this going and putting more people back to work.
I'm going to just, we have to close. I'm just going to have one more question.
Sure.
As Jeff mentioned in his opening, in 2014 you ran for governor of California. Can you tell us a couple things that you learned from that experience, and would you consider another run for governor or another elected office?
So a couple things I learned. Let's start there. One of the things that I really enjoyed about running for governor, I ran on a platform of economic opportunity. My entire platform was literally, my slogan was jobs and education, that's it. Because my view is if you have a strong economy and people are getting a good education, most other problems in society tend to deal with themselves. So it was not a sharply partisan campaign. I met the widest range of people imaginable. I mean, I literally met people from actual billionaires to actual homeless people and everything in between, who otherwise I probably would not have had a chance to meet with. And one of the things I learned is that the vast majority of people are good. The vast majority of people want to build a better life for themselves or their families, or want to help their neighbors achieve a better life. And that's a lot to work with. If most people in society kind of want to help each other out and achieve a better outcome, we got a lot going for us. So that gave me a great degree of optimism. I would never say never about potentially running for office again, but I couldn't see it in the next 20 years. I mean, I just got to the Fed. I'm loving it. I'm getting to work on many of the same economic issues that I ran. The reason I joined the Fed is the same reason I ran for office. I care deeply about public policy. Good public policy really makes a difference. And one way of affecting change was by becoming an elected official. Another way of promoting change is by working at an institution like the Federal Reserve. And so I feel like I'm scratching my itch by being at the Fed, and I'm really enjoying living in Minnesota. So maybe in 20 years, but for now, I'm happy at the Fed. So,
I think we have a
thank you very much. I really appreciate it.